The kitchen was completely dark, except for the amber, pulsing glow of a cigar. He shouldn't have been awake. He definitely shouldn't have been waiting for her. Sadie froze, her hand hovering inches from the light switch. Then he moved out of the shadows, the oppressive silence of the house pressing hard against her eardrums. His dark eyes bypassed her face entirely, locking on to the pale pink carnations sitting on the counter. "Who?" Roman whispered, the gravel in his voice scraping against the quiet. "Gave you those flowers?" Working for a crime syndicate was not like the movies. It wasn't a string of glamorous parties, sharp-tailored suits, and clinking champagne flutes. It was bleach, gallons and gallons of industrial-strength bleach. It was silence, heavy and suffocating, and the constant, exhausting effort of making yourself as small and invisible as a field mouse. Sadie wiped down the marble island in the kitchen for the 4th time that afternoon. Dust didn't settle in the Costa estate. The air was too thick with tension for anything to truly rest. She pressed her weight into the rag, scrubbing at a faint water ring until her knuckles ached. At 24, she had spent 3 years blending into the beige wallpaper and dark mahogany of this fortress on Long Island. She wore a starched grey uniform that fit poorly, kept her hair tied back in a severe, joyless knot, and spoke only when spoken to, which was rare. The staff had 3 unspoken rules. First, never look Roman Costa in the eye. Second, never ask about the dark, rust-colored stains that sometimes ruined the cuffs of his expensive dress shirts. Third, never touch the locked drawers in his ground-floor study. Sadie followed these rules with a religious devotion. It kept her employed. More importantly, it kept her breathing. But today, a tiny crack had formed in the sterile, terrifying routine of her life. They were sitting in a cheap, cloudy glass vase near the staff sink. A small, slightly bruised bouquet of pink carnations and baby's breath. Harmless. Sweet. Entirely out of place in a house built on extortion, concrete, and blood. They had arrived at noon. The delivery boy from the local bakery in town had brought the weekly order of fresh bread. His name was Toby. He was 19, all elbows and nervous smiles, and he had spent the last 2 months lingering in the service entrance longer than necessary. Today, he had shoved the paper-wrapped bundle of flowers into Sadie's hands, turned the color of a bruised plum, and sprinted back to his delivery van before she could even say thank you. She should have thrown them away. The Costa estate was a place devoid of color. Bringing bright pink flowers into this house felt like sneaking a bomb through security. But she hadn't. She had filled a water glass, trimmed the stems with a pair of kitchen shears, and set them on the counter. Just for the afternoon. Just to look at something that hadn't been bought with dirty money. Every time she walked past the sink, she caught a faint, peppery whiff of the carnations, and for a split second, she wasn't a maid in a mob boss's house. She was just a girl who got flowers. The fantasy shattered at exactly 6 in the evening. The heavy oak front doors opened with a deep, echoing thud. The sound reverberated through the first floor, sending an immediate electric shock of anxiety through the staff. Roman was home early. Sadie stopped scrubbing the counter. In the adjoining dining room, 2 other maids abandoned their polishing rags and practically melted into the hallways, seeking refuge in the upper floors. Sadie stayed put. If you ran too fast, you drew attention. If you stayed too still, you were an obstacle. She heard the heavy tread of his boots on the hardwood. Roman Costa did not walk. He prowled. There was a predatory economy to his movements. He never wasted a step. He was a man who carried the weight of his father's violent empire on his shoulders, and he wore the burden like a suit of armor. He moved past the kitchen archway. Sadie kept her head down, her eyes fixed firmly on the polished toe of his leather boots. She caught the smell of him as he passed, a sharp mixture of expensive bergamot cologne, stale cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic tang of copper. Rain clung to the wool of his dark coat. He didn't glance in her direction. He rarely did. To Roman, the staff were just furniture that occasionally swept the floors. "I want the perimeter locked down," Roman's voice echoed from the foyer, low and flat. He was speaking to his underboss, a hulking shadow of a man who always trailed a few steps behind. "Nobody comes through the front gate unless I clear it. If that rat shows his face again, break his knees and leave him in the driveway." "Yes, boss." "And get me a drink. Bring it to the study." The heavy mahogany door of the study clicked shut. The lock engaged with a sharp snap. The house let out a collective breath. Sadie stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the rain begin to lash against the reinforced glass windows. She looked over at the pink carnations by the sink. Suddenly, they didn't look sweet anymore. They looked stupid, naive. A splash of pathetic optimism in a house that ground optimism into dust. She reached out, intending to snatch them from the glass and bury them at the bottom of the trash bin under the coffee grounds. But her shift was over. Her legs ached, her head was pounding, and she was too tired to care. She left the flowers on the counter, turned off the overhead fluorescents, and retreated to her small quarters in the basement. She thought she was safe. She thought the day was done. At 2 a.m., the thirst woke her. It was a dry, scraping feeling in the back of her throat, brought on by the suffocating heat of the basement radiator. Sadie lay in the dark for 10 minutes, trying to ignore it, trying to will herself back to sleep. The basement was safe, the upstairs was not, but the thirst won. She slipped out of her narrow bed, shivering as her bare feet hit the cold concrete floor. She didn't bother grabbing a robe. She was wearing an oversized, faded grey t-shirt and loose cotton shorts. The house was a tomb at this hour. The guards were stationed outside in the rain, and Roman was surely passed out in his sprawling master suite on the 3rd floor. She crept up the back stairwell, opening the heavy fire door to the main floor with practiced, agonizing slowness to prevent the hinges from squeaking. The hallway was pitch black. She didn't turn on a light, navigating by memory and the faint grey illumination bleeding through the tall windows from the security floodlights outside. She stepped into the cavernous kitchen. She didn't see him at first. The kitchen was massive, all stainless steel and black marble, absorbing the shadows. She walked straight to the refrigerator, pulled the heavy handle, and grabbed a plastic bottle of water. She twisted the cap off, taking a long, desperate drink. Then she heard it. The faint, wet clink of ice against crystal. Sadie froze. The water bottle slipped an inch in her sweaty grip. She turned her head slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped animal. Roman was sitting in the darkest corner of the kitchen, at the small breakfast table usually reserved for the head chef. He was slouched in the chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. The tailored suit jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dark, creeping ink of his tattoos. In his right hand, he held a lowball glass of scotch. In his left, a cigar smoldered, casting a faint, demonic orange glow over his sharp, exhausted features. He was watching her. He had been watching her the whole time. "Sir," Sadie breathed, her voice cracking. She immediately dropped her gaze to the floor, heat flooding her cheeks. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly intensely aware of her bare legs and the thin fabric of her worn t-shirt. "I apologize. I didn't think anyone was awake. I'll leave." She took a step backward toward the hallway. "Stop." The word wasn't a shout. It was barely above a murmur, but it hit her like a physical blow. Her bare feet glued themselves to the marble tile. Roman took a slow drag from his cigar. The ember flared, illuminating the deep, dark circles under his eyes and the hard, unforgiving line of his jaw. He exhaled a thick plume of grey smoke into the dark kitchen. He didn't look at her face. His dark, heavy gaze was fixed on something to her left. "Who?" Roman whispered, the gravel in his voice scraping against the quiet. "Gave you those flowers?" Sadie blinked, her mind going blank. She looked toward the sink. The pink carnations. They were barely visible in the gloom, a greyish smudge against the backsplash. "The flowers, sir," she stammered, entirely thrown by the question. Of all the things a Mafia boss could ask his maid in the middle of the night, this wasn't even on the map. Roman set his glass down on the table. The sound was deafening in the silence. He stood up. He was a massive man, standing well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and lethal. As he closed the distance between them, the sheer physical gravity of him seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Sadie pressed her spine against the refrigerator door. The cold steel seeped through her shirt, making her shiver. He stopped less than 2 feet away. She could smell the scotch on his breath, bitter and sharp, cutting through the smoke. She kept her eyes trained firmly on his collarbone. "I asked you a question, Sadie." He knew her name. The realization sent a cold spike of adrenaline straight through her nervous system. In 3 years, he had never called her by her name. She had just been the girl, or you. "They were just a gift," she said, her voice shaking violently now. "From the bakery delivery boy, Toby. He brought the bread this afternoon. It was nothing, sir. I can throw them away." "Toby," Roman repeated. He rolled the names around in his mouth like a piece of spoiled meat. "The kid with the stutter who drives the beat-up Ford." He knew the delivery boy. He knew everything. Roman reached out. Sadie flinched, bracing herself, but his hand bypassed her entirely. He picked up the cheap glass vase from the counter. He held it up in the dim light, rotating it slowly. His large, calloused fingers dwarfed the fragile glass. "Pink carnations," he murmured. His tone was impossible to read. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder, more calculating. "Bought from the corner bodega, probably. $3, wrapped in newspaper, and he handed them to you at my back door." "I didn't ask for them," Sadie said quickly, desperate to diffuse whatever twisted fuse had been lit in his brain. "I didn't encourage it. I swear." Roman slowly lowered his gaze from the flowers to her face. For the first time in 3 years, Sadie looked directly into his eyes. They were pitch black, bottomless, and utterly terrifying. But beneath the coldness there was a strange, vibrating tension. "He crossed my property line," Roman said, his voice dropping an octave, stepping half a pace closer. His chest brushed the fabric of her t-shirt. "He walked up to my house, and he gave something that belongs to me, a gift." Sadie stopped breathing. "Something that belongs to me. I'm just a maid," she whispered, her hands gripping the water bottle so hard the plastic crunched. Roman's jaw flexed. He looked down at the flowers in his hand, then suddenly tilted his wrist. The glass vase tipped. The water spilled over the rim, splashing onto the pristine counter, followed by the wet, pathetic slap of the pink carnations hitting the marble. He didn't break the glass. He just set it down beside the ruined flowers. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The heat radiating off his body was overwhelming. "Nothing in this house is just anything, Sadie. Everything inside these walls is mine. The air, the floorboards, you." He reached out, tracing a single, rough knuckle down the line of her jaw. The touch burned. "Tomorrow," he said softly. You tell the guards at the gate to ban the bakery van. If I see that kid near my back door again, he won't walk away from it. Do you understand?" The carnations looked worse in the daylight. Sadie stood over the kitchen island at 6 in the morning, a damp dish rag clenched in her right hand. The stems were bent at awkward angles, the pink petals bruised shut, clinging to the wet marble where Roman had left them. She didn't put them in the trash under the coffee grounds. She shoved them deep into the industrial incinerator chute in the alleyway behind the kitchen. She wanted them gone. She wanted the memory of last night burned into ash. Her hands were shaking. They hadn't stopped shaking since she crawled back into her narrow basement bed 4 hours ago. Everything inside these walls is mine. The words played on a relentless, terrifying loop in her head. She had spent 3 years turning herself into a ghost. She knew exactly how many steps it took to cross the foyer without stepping on a creaking floorboard. She knew how to polish the silver without making it clink. She had survived by being nothing. Roman had ripped that armor away with a single, calloused knuckle against her jaw. "You look like hell," a sharp voice snapped. Sadie jumped, dropping the rag. Gordon, the estate's head chef, was marching through the swinging doors, tying a thick white apron around his waist. He was a broad, aggressively loud man who treated the kitchen like a war zone. "Didn't sleep well," Sadie mumbled, picking up the rag and turning her face away to hide the dark circles under her eyes. "Well, wake up. We have 20 people for dinner tonight. The capos are coming in from Jersey." Gordon slammed a heavy cast-iron skillet onto the 6-burner stove. "And where is the bread? The kid is usually here by 6. Sadie's stomach plummeted. The bread. "Toby. I need to check on something outside," she said, her voice tight. Before Gordon could yell at her to stay put, she pushed through the back door into the freezing morning air. The estate grounds were wrapped in a thick, damp fog rolling in off the Atlantic. The gravel crunched under her rubber-soled work shoes as she walked briskly down the long, winding driveway toward the main gate. The security booth was a reinforced steel pillbox sitting behind 12-foot wrought-iron gates. Miller was on duty. He was a former Marine who worked for the Costa family, a man whose neck was wider than Sadie's waist. He was leaning against the booth, drinking black coffee from a thermos, an assault rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He raised a thick eyebrow as she approached. Staff rarely came down to the gate. "Lost, sweetheart?" Miller asked, his voice a low rumble. Sadie stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms against the biting chill. "Mr. Costa gave an order last night," she said. Her voice wavered, and she hated herself for it. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out flat and cold. "The bakery van, the kid who delivers the bread. He's permanently banned from the property. He doesn't come through this gate." Miller frowned, lowering his thermos. "Gordon expects that delivery. He's going to throw a fit." "Mr. Costa's orders," Sadie repeated. Her fingernails dug into the sleeves of her thin sweater. "He said if the kid shows his face, he won't walk away from it." Understanding flickered in Miller's eyes. He didn't ask questions. In this world, you didn't question an order from the boss, especially one wrapped in a threat of violence. He simply nodded, tapping his earpiece. "Understood. I'll pass it to the shift rotation. Bakery kid is out." Sadie turned and walked back to the house, the fog clinging to her hair. She felt sick. She had just cost a 19-year-old kid a massive commercial account, maybe even his job. But the alternative was Toby getting his kneecaps shattered in the driveway because he smiled at her. By noon, the house was a powder keg. Gordon was screaming at the sous chefs because the backup bread delivery from a chain supermarket was stale. The maids were rushing frantically to prep the dining room for the Mafia bosses arriving that evening. And Roman was a ghost. He hadn't emerged from the 3rd floor. At 1:15 p.m., Sadie was polishing the heavy brass handles of the dining room doors when she heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel. She froze, the polishing cloth slipping from her hand. She moved to the tall windows overlooking the front circular drive, keeping her body hidden behind the heavy velvet drapes. It wasn't the delivery van. It was Toby's personal car, a beat-up, rust-bucket Ford sedan. He had parked outside the iron gates. He was standing on the asphalt, gesturing wildly at Miller. Even from this distance, Sadie could see the panic in his lanky frame. He was holding a small, brown paper bag, probably bringing the bread himself, trying to save the account. Miller didn't move. He just stood on the other side of the iron bars, shaking his head. Toby took a step closer, gripping the iron bars, pleading. Sadie's breath hitched in her throat. "Go away. Please, Toby, just turn around and drive." Miller unslung the rifle from his shoulder. He didn't point it at Toby, but the implication was deafening. He rested his hand on the grip. Toby stopped talking. He stared at the weapon, then looked past the gate, his eyes scanning the massive, imposing facade of the Costa estate. He looked small, defeated. He slowly backed away, dropped the paper bag on the wet asphalt, got into his Ford, and drove away. Sadie let out a shaky breath, her forehead resting against the cold window pane. He was safe. "Did you think I was bluffing?" The voice was directly behind her, right at her ear. Sadie gasped, spinning around so fast she slammed her elbow into the window frame. Roman was standing there. He moved like a shadow, making no sound on the hardwood floor. He was wearing a charcoal suit today, perfectly tailored, shedding the exhausted, disheveled look from the night before. His dark hair was neatly slicked back, but his eyes were just as merciless. He was staring out the window, watching the taillights of Toby's car disappear down the road. "No, sir," Sadie whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I didn't think you were bluffing." Roman finally looked at her. He took in her pale face, her trembling hands, the cheap grey uniform that swallowed her figure. His gaze was heavy, possessive, and suffocating. "Good," he said, his voice a low, terrifying purr. "Go to my study. Wait for me there." The study was a room Sadie was paid to clean but forbidden to occupy. It was a masculine, oppressive space situated at the back of the ground floor, overlooking the private gardens. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves holding leather-bound volumes that no one ever read. The air always smelled faintly of gun oil, aged scotch, and expensive cigar smoke. Sadie stood rigidly in the center of the Persian rug, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She'd been waiting for 20 minutes. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the corner felt like a hammer striking her nerves. Maids did not get summoned to the study. Men went into the study. Men with thick necks, scarred knuckles, and bulging jackets. Sometimes they came out looking pale and sweaty. Sometimes they didn't come out at all, quietly escorted out the side doors by Roman security. The heavy door clicked open. Sadie flinched, instinctively taking a half-step backward. Roman walked in, shutting the door behind him with a firm, solid thud. He didn't look at her immediately. He walked to his massive desk, tossing a leather folder onto the polished wood. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, sat down in his high-backed leather chair, and let out a long, slow exhale. He looked exhausted again. The mask he wore for his capos and his soldiers was slipping, just a fraction, in the privacy of his sanctuary. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to one of the two wingback chairs facing his desk. "I prefer to stand, sir. If it's all the same to you," Sadie said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the study, it carried. Roman paused, his dark eyes flicked up, locking onto hers. A dangerous, quiet tension filled the room, pressing against Sadie's lungs. She had defied a direct order. It was a small defiance, a pathetic attempt to maintain some illusion of boundaries. But in his world, defiance was usually met with broken bones. Instead of snapping, Roman leaned back in his chair. He studied her for a long, agonizing moment. "Suit yourself." He reached under his desk. Sadie's breath hitched, her mind instantly flashing to a hidden firearm. But when his hand reappeared, he wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a box. It was a long, rectangular box made of dark, polished wood, completely devoid of any florist branding or ribbon. It looked expensive. It looked heavy. He set it on the desk between them and flipped the brass latch. He didn't open it. He just pushed it across the smooth surface of the desk toward her. "Open it." Sadie hesitated. Her legs felt like lead. She forced herself to step forward, her cheap shoes sinking into the expensive rug. She reached out with trembling fingers and lifted the wooden lid. There were no pink carnations inside. There was no baby's breath. Laying against a bed of black velvet were a dozen black baccara roses. They were massive, the blooms heavy and flawless. The petals were a red so deep, so dark, they appeared almost entirely black in the dim light of the study. They didn't look like a gift. They looked like a warning. They looked like fresh blood. The stems were completely stripped of leaves and thorns, smooth and perfectly cut. Sadie stared down at them, a cold dread washing over her. She couldn't speak. She didn't know what to say. Thank you felt absurd. Running felt suicidal. "A man who gives a woman carnations," Roman said, his voice slicing through the silence, "does so because he is cheap or because he is a coward. He gives her something fragile because he expects it to die in a few days. He expects to be forgotten." He stood up, walking slowly around the desk. Sadie's instinct screamed at her to back away, but her feet remained rooted to the floor. Roman stopped right beside her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could smell the bergamot and the sharp, clean scent of his soap. He reached into the box and pulled out one of the dark, heavy roses. He held it up, the nearly black petals contrasting sharply with his pale, scarred fingers. "I do not give things that die easily, Sadie," he murmured. He reached out, his hand moving toward her face. She closed her eyes, bracing for the harsh, terrifying touch from last night. But his fingers didn't touch her skin. He slid the smooth stem of the rose behind her ear, tucking it securely against her tightly pulled hair. The velvet petals brushed against her cheek. They were cold. Sadie opened her eyes. Roman was staring down at her, his expression unreadable, a stormy mix of possessiveness and something deeply, unnervingly feral. "Take the box to your room," he ordered, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Put them in water. You will look at them every morning when you wake up, and you will look at them every night before you sleep." "Mr. Costa," she started, her voice trembling. "Roman," he corrected her softly. His thumb brushed against her lower lip, silencing her. It was a feather-light touch, completely at odds with the violent reality of the man. "Say it!" Her lungs burned. She couldn't draw enough air. "Roman." Satisfaction flashed in his dark eyes. He dropped his hand and took a step back, the suffocating pressure lifting just enough for her to breathe again. "Take the box, Sadie, and then get back to work. My guests will be arriving in an hour." Sadie reached down and grabbed the wooden box. It felt like holding a coffin. She turned and walked rigidly toward the door, the dark rose still tucked behind her ear, burning against her skin like a brand. She didn't look back. She knew if she did, she would see him watching her. She belonged to the house now. She belonged to him. Sadie did not have a vase. Her basement quarters consisted of a twin bed with a sagging mattress, a metal folding chair, and a particle board dresser that smelled faintly of mildew. She ended up putting the dozen black baccara roses into a plastic, grey mop bucket she had scrubbed clean in the utility sink. The contrast was sickening. The heavy, velvety blooms leaned against the cheap grey plastic, drinking tap water in the dim, flickering light of a bare fluorescent bulb. They looked like royalty dragged into a dungeon. Sadie sat on the edge of her bed, her hands wedged between her knees, staring at them. Her scalp still tingled where Roman's fingers had brushed her skin. She had taken the single rose from behind her ear the second she stepped out of the study. Gordon would have fired her on the spot if she had walked into his kitchen wearing jewelry, let alone a flower given by the boss. But hiding it didn't erase it. The weight of Roman's attention felt like a physical chain locked around her neck. "Sadie, get up here!" Gordon's muffled shout bled through the floorboards. She checked her watch. 7:30. The guests had arrived. She stood up, smoothed down the front of her grey uniform, and walked back up into the war zone. The dining room was a sprawling, cavernous space, dominated by a 20-foot mahogany table. Tonight, it was packed with men who wore expensive Italian wool, but possessed the blunt, heavy knuckles of street thugs. These were the capos from the New Jersey factions. They were loud, they drank heavily, they ate like starving dogs. The air was thick with the smell of roasted garlic, seared prime rib, and the sharp, stinging haze of cigar smoke. Sadie moved through the room like a ghost, carrying a heavy silver tray of empty plates. Rule number 1. Never look them in the eye. Rule number 2. Never linger. She approached the head of the table to clear a discarded bread basket. Roman sat at the absolute center of the chaos, projecting a terrifying, silent authority. He wasn't eating. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling an inch of dark red wine in a crystal glass, listening to a heavy-set man to his left complain about shipping container tariffs at the docks. Roman was wearing a black dress shirt, top 2 buttons undone. He looked relaxed. He looked lethal. As Sadie reached for the bread basket, she felt a heavy, sweaty hand clamp down hard on her hip. She froze. The silver tray in her hands rattled loudly against the wood table. "Well now," a voice rumbled. It was Dominic, a capo from Newark with a thick neck and a face violently scarred by old knife fights. He was seated 2 chairs down from Roman. Dominic didn't let go. His fingers dug painfully into her hip bone through the thin cotton of her uniform. He pulled her slightly off balance, leaning in so close she could smell the sour stench of red wine and chewing tobacco on his breath. "Costa," Dominic barked, grinning around a half-chewed piece of meat. "You holding out on us? Since when do you hire staff that look like this? The last girl you had serving us had a mustache." A few of the men at the table chuckled. It was a guttural, ugly sound. Sadie's heart slammed against her ribs. She tried to step back, to pull away smoothly without causing a scene. But Dominic's grip was iron. He dragged his thumb upward, catching the hem of her apron. "Let go," Sadie whispered, her voice shaking. It was a mistake. Maids didn't speak. "Feisty," Dominic laughed, yanking her an inch closer. "I like that. Maybe you come back to Jersey with me tonight, sweetheart. Teach you how to pour wine properly." The dining room went dead silent. The laughter choked off. The clinking of silverware stopped. The sudden absence of noise was deafening, heavier than the smoke in the air. Sadie stopped struggling. She looked up. Roman had stopped swirling his wine. He placed the crystal glass carefully on the table. He didn't look at Dominic. He didn't look at Sadie. He reached out and picked up his heavy, serrated steak knife. Without a word, Roman pressed the tip of the blade down into his porcelain dinner plate. He applied pressure. Then he dragged the steel slowly across the ceramic. Screech! The sound was excruciating. It set Sadie's teeth on edge and sent a violent shudder down her spine. It was a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of metal on porcelain. Every man at the table flinched. Roman lifted the knife. He pressed the tip down again. Screech! He did it a third time, the terrible sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Then he set the knife down. He finally turned his head, locking his dark, bottomless eyes on Dominic. "Take your hand off her," Roman said. He didn't yell. The words were quiet, perfectly enunciated, and utterly devoid of emotion. But the threat hanging beneath them was absolute. It was the voice of a man who wouldn't just kill you, he would burn your house down and salt the earth where it stood. Dominic's grin vanished. The color drained from his scarred face, leaving him a sickly, greyish white. His fingers instantly uncurled from Sadie's hip, snapping back to his own lap, as if he had touched a live wire. "Just a joke, boss," Dominic stammered, wiping a napkin nervously across his sweaty forehead. "No disrespect, just a joke." Roman stared at him for 3 agonizing seconds. "She is not a joke. She is mine. If you touch her again, Dominic, I will take your hand at the wrist, and I will make you eat it." The words hung in the air, a public execution of Dominic's pride. The capo swallowed hard, nodding quickly, his eyes dropping to the table. "Get out," Roman said softly. Sadie didn't wait for clarification. She turned and practically bolted through the swinging kitchen doors, the silver tray clutched to her chest like a shield, gasping for air as if she had just surfaced from drowning. It was 2:30 in the morning. The capos had left hours ago. The house had settled into its familiar, oppressive quiet. Sadie stood at the industrial stainless steel sink in the kitchen, her hands submerged in scalding, soapy water. She was washing the crystal wine glasses from the dinner service. Gordon and the other maids had gone to bed at midnight, but Sadie couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Dominic's heavy hand on her hip. Worse, she felt the terrifying weight of Roman's words. "She is mine." She scrubbed a dark red wine stain from the rim of a glass, her knuckles white. He hadn't protected her. He had marked her. In front of 20 of the most dangerous men on the East Coast, Roman Costa had claimed a maid as his personal property. The heavy kitchen door pushed open. Sadie didn't jump this time. She just closed her eyes for a brief second, took a steadying breath, and kept scrubbing the glass. She knew his footsteps. She knew the exact cadence of his heavy boots against the marble floor. Roman walked to the counter beside the sink. He dropped a half-empty bottle of scotch onto the surface with a heavy thud. He was missing his jacket and tie. His white undershirt was visible beneath his unbuttoned dress shirt. There was a smear of dark, rusty blood on his left cuff. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, watching her profile. Sadie didn't acknowledge him. She picked up another glass, plunged it into the hot water, and began scrubbing. The silence stretched between them, thick and vibrating. "You're angry," Roman finally said. His voice was rough, sandpaper on wood, exhausted from hours of posturing and veiled threats. "I am working," Sadie replied flatly. She kept her eyes on the suds. "You're scrubbing a clean glass, Sadie. You've been washing the same piece of crystal for 3 minutes. She stopped. Her shoulders dropped. She carefully set the glass on the drying rack, pulled her hands out of the scalding water and dried them on a towel. She turned to face him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being smothered by a sudden, reckless wave of exhaustion. She was tired of being a ghost. She was tired of being terrified in her own skin. "You put a target on my back tonight," Sadie said, her voice shaking, but she held his gaze. "Those men. They talk. By tomorrow morning, Half of the families in New York are going to know that the untouchable Roman Costa lost his temper over a maid. Roman's expression didn't change. He simply reached out, grabbed the bottle of scotch, and took a long drink straight from the neck. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Let them talk. You don't get it, she snapped, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. It was the first time she had ever moved toward him willingly. I survive in this house by being invisible. If I am invisible, I am safe. Dominic touched me because I am a nobody. But you told him I belong to you. You do. The words hit her like a physical strike. I am an employee, Mr. Costa. I scrub your floors. I wash your blood out of the rugs. You pay me $400 a week. That buys my labor. It does not buy me. Roman's eyes darkened. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He set the bottle down and pushed off the counter. He closed the remaining gap between them in a single stride, backing her up against the edge of the deep sink. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The sheer physical dominance of his frame caged her in completely. "Do you think I care about the money?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. "Do you think a paycheck is what binds you to this house?" "Then what is it?" She shot back, her chest heaving, the adrenaline making her reckless. "Why the flowers? Why the display in the dining room?" "I am nothing to you." Roman leaned down. His face was inches from hers. She could see the faint, silvery scar cutting through his left eyebrow. She could smell the scotch and the copper tang of blood clinging to his clothes. "You have lived in my house for 3 years," Roman murmured, his eyes tracking the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat. "For 3 years, I have watched you hold your breath every time I walk into a room. I have watched you press yourself into the walls, trying to disappear." He reached up slowly. Sadie flinched, but she didn't pull away. He brushed a damp strand of hair off her forehead, his rough thumb lingering against her temple. "I live in a world surrounded by men who lie to my face," Roman said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual cold command. It sounded hollow, raw. "Men who smile while they plot to put a bullet in my spine. Everything I touch rots. Everything I build is built on graves." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, wiping away a drop of soapy water. "And then there is you," he breathed. "A girl who flinches when a door slams. A girl who takes bruised carnations from a delivery boy because it's the only beautiful thing she's seen in months." He leaned in closer, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You think I marked you tonight to put a target on your back? I marked you so every rat in that room knows that if they even look at you too long, I will end their bloodline. You aren't invisible anymore, Sadie. You are the only real thing in this godforsaken house, and I am keeping you." The shift in the house happened overnight. It wasn't a loud, formal announcement. It was a terrifying, suffocating silence that settled over the staff the moment Sadie walked into the kitchen the next morning. She was running late. She had barely slept, spending the remaining hours of the night staring at the cracked ceiling of her basement room, the heavy scent of the black baccara, roses filling the cramped space. When she pushed through the swinging doors at 6:30, bracing herself for Gordon's usual tirade, the kitchen was dead quiet. Gordon was standing at the butcher block, aggressively breaking down a side of beef with a heavy cleaver. He stopped mid-swing when she entered. He didn't yell. He didn't tell her she looked like a corpse. He simply wiped his bloody hands on a towel, cleared his throat, and looked away. "Morning," Gordon muttered, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor tiles. Sadie froze. Gordon never said good morning. He barked orders. He threw wooden spoons. "I'm sorry I'm late," Sadie said, her voice sounding entirely too loud in the cavernous room. "I'll start the coffee and get to the dining room." "Take your time," Gordon replied stiffly. He picked up his cleaver and went back to the beef, his shoulders rigid. It wasn't just Gordon. It was everyone. When Sadie went to the linen closet to gather fresh rags, Maria, a maid who had worked at the estate for 10 years, practically flattened herself against the wall to let Sadie pass. Maria didn't make eye contact. She kept her chin tucked to her chest, her hands clasped nervously in front of her apron. They knew. In a house built on secrets, whispers moved faster than electricity. They knew what Roman had done in the dining room. They knew he had put a knife to his own dinner plate to threaten a capo over a maid. To the staff, Sadie was no longer a co-worker. She was radioactive. She was the boss's property, a walking trigger that could get any of them fired or killed if they looked at her wrong. The isolation was immediate, and it was crushing. Sadie spent the first half of her shift moving through the house in a daze, dusting the same mahogany tables she dusted every day. But the mechanics of her life had fundamentally fractured. She was a ghost who had suddenly been made entirely, dangerously visible. By noon, the quiet panic in her chest had morphed into a hard, desperate need for air. She couldn't breathe in the house. Every time she rounded a corner, she expected to see Roman's dark, heavy gaze waiting for her. She walked back into the kitchen. Gordon was plating a light lunch for the guards. "Gordon," Sadie said, keeping her voice steady. "We are out of the heavy silver polish. The dining room credenza needs a second coat before the weekend. I'm going to take the staff car and go into town to get some." It was a test. The staff car was an old Honda parked near the service entrance. Maids frequently took it to the hardware store or the local grocer for last-minute supplies. Gordon stopped plating. He set down his tongs, a bead of sweat rolling down his red face. He looked painfully uncomfortable. "No need. I'll have one of the security boys run out and get it." "They don't know the right brand," Sadie countered, taking a step closer to the butcher block. "It's fine. I don't mind going. It will take 20 minutes. "Sadie," Gordon warned, his voice dropping to a low, tight whisper. He finally looked her in the eye, and the raw fear in his expression made her stomach turn. "Don't push it. You know you can't leave." "I am an employee," Sadie insisted, though her voice shook. "I need supplies." She didn't wait for his permission. She unhooked the Honda keys from the pegboard by the back door, grabbed her thin wool coat, and walked out into the biting afternoon chill. Her hands were shaking violently as she unlocked the car, slid into the driver's seat, and cranked the ignition. She drove slowly down the long, winding driveway. The heavy canopy of oak trees blocked out the pale winter sun, casting long, skeletal shadows across the asphalt. Ahead of her, the massive iron gates loomed, flanked by the reinforced security booth. Miller was on duty again. He stepped out of the booth as the Honda approached, holding up a large, gloved hand. Sadie rolled the window down. The cold air bit at her cheeks. "Hey, Miller, I'm just making a run to the hardware store for Gordon. Silver polish." Miller didn't smile. He rested his hands on his tactical belt, looking down at her with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Turn the car around, Sadie." "It's a staff errand, Miller. I have the keys." "The keys don't mean a damn thing," Miller said flatly. "Mr. Costa updated the perimeter protocols this morning at 0600. No unauthorized vehicles in or out. And you are specifically flagged." Sadie gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. "Flagged? What does that mean?" "It means you don't go past the iron," Miller replied, his voice softening just a fraction. "Not in a car. Not on foot. Not unless the boss is standing right beside you. I have strict orders, sweetheart. If you try to drive through this gate, I have to deploy the spike strip. Turn the car around. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Sadie stared at the heavy iron bars of the gate. Beyond them lay the quiet, normal street. A world where people bought pink carnations and worried about traffic and electricity bills. It was right there, 50 feet away, and it was completely unreachable. She swallowed the hard lump of panic rising in her throat, put the car in reverse, and backed slowly up the driveway. She wasn't just marked. She was caged. Sadie didn't return to the kitchen. She parked the Honda near the service entrance, left the keys in the ignition, and walked straight toward the west wing of the estate. The fear that had kept her invisible for 3 years was gone, burned away by a sudden, blinding fury. She found him in the greenhouse. The glass structure was attached to the back of the house, a sprawling, humid jungle of exotic orchids, ferns, and heavy vines imported from South America. Roman's father had built it for his wife decades ago. Now it was just another quiet place for Roman to conduct business he didn't want bleeding into his home. The air inside was thick, smelling of wet earth and blooming jasmine. Sadie pushed through the heavy glass doors, the humidity instantly dampening her skin. Roman was at the far end of the greenhouse, standing at a wooden potting table. He had stripped off his suit jacket and tie, wearing only his dress trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was carefully trimming the dead leaves off a sprawling fern with a pair of silver shears. He didn't look up when the door slammed shut. He already knew she was there. "I tried to leave," Sadie said, her voice echoing sharply against the glass panes. She marched down the center aisle, her rubber-soled shoes slapping aggressively against the wet stone floor. "I know," Roman replied, his tone conversational. Snipping a browned leaf, he tossed it onto the damp floor. "Miller radioed me the second you put the key in the ignition. He said you wanted silver polish." Sadie stopped a few feet away from the table. Her chest was heaving, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. "You made me a prisoner." Roman set the shears down. He slowly picked up a white towel from the bench and wiped the dirt from his hands. He turned to face her, leaning his hips against the edge of the wooden table. He looked entirely calm, a maddening contrast to the storm raging inside her. "I made you secure," he corrected quietly. "You told the guards to lock me inside," Sadie shouted, the volume of her own voice shocking her. She had never raised her voice in this house. She had never spoken to him without looking at his shoes. Now, she was glaring straight into his dark, dangerous eyes. "You told them to use a spike strip on me. You isolated me from the entire staff. Gordon won't even look at me. I am trapped." "You are breathing," Roman said, stepping away from the table. The calm facade cracked slightly, a hard, protective edge bleeding into his voice. "Do you have any idea what happened when Dominic left this house last night?" Sadie flinched, the memory of the capo's sweaty hand on her hip making her stomach twist. She held her ground. "I don't care." "You should," Roman snapped, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped inches from her, his sheer size forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Dominic went back to Newark with a bruised ego. A capo doesn't get humiliated in front of 20 men and just swallow it. He talks. He makes plans. By 8 o'clock this morning, the rumor was already circulating that Roman Costa has a soft spot for a little maid with brown hair." He reached out, grabbing her gently by the upper arms. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. There was no moving away from him. "In my world, Sadie, a soft spot is a liability. It is a target. If you had driven out of that gate today, How far do you think you would have gotten? A mile? 2? Dominic's men are likely sitting in a parked car down the block right now, waiting to see if I am stupid enough to let you walk out alone. The remaining fight drained out of Sadie, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. She stared at his chest, the reality of the violence surrounding her finally sinking in. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was leverage. I didn't ask for this, she whispered, a traitorous tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't ask for the flowers. I didn't ask for you to claim me in that dining room. I just wanted to do my job and be left alone. Roman's jaw tightened. He let go of her arms, raising one hand to carefully wipe the tear from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. The calloused skin dragged gently against her face. I know you didn't, he murmured, the gravel in his voice softening into something entirely too intimate. But the die is cast. I put the target on your back to protect you from the immediate threat in my dining room, and in doing so, I made you mine to the rest of the world. I cannot undo it. So I stay in this house forever? She asked, her voice cracking. I just wait in the basement? No. Roman turned away, walking to a small wooden lockbox resting on a shelf beneath a row of orchids. He punched a 3-digit code into the heavy brass lock. It clicked open. He pulled something out and walked back to her. He took her right hand, prying her clenched fingers open, and pressed the heavy, freezing metal object into her palm. Sadie looked down. It was a compact, matte black Glock 19. It felt impossibly heavy. If you are going to survive in my house, you do not wait in the basement, Roman said, his eyes burning into hers with a fierce, uncompromising intensity. You learn to defend what is yours. Starting tomorrow, you don't scrub floors. You come to the range with me. You learn how to use this. You learn how to look a man in the eye and make him understand that if he touches you, he dies. Sadie stared at the weapon in her hand. It was terrifying. It was power. I am a maid, she breathed, her fingers wrapping slowly around the grip. Roman reached out, tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb resting against her pulse. The heat of his touch sent a violent shiver down her spine. Not anymore, Sadie. Not anymore. The grey uniform went into the industrial incinerator on a Tuesday. Sadie stood in the damp alleyway behind the kitchen, watching the cheap, starchy fabric catch fire. The flames curled the edges of the apron, turning the cotton into thick, black smoke. She didn't feel a sense of liberation. She felt the heavy, terrifying weight of a bridge burning behind her. There was no going back to being invisible. Her new reality smelled like copper, gun oil, and burnt powder. Roman moved her out of the basement that afternoon. She was relocated to a sprawling guest suite on the second floor, a room heavily reinforced with solid oak doors and shatterproof glass. Her closet was suddenly filled with dark denim, heavy-knit sweaters, and leather boots. But the most significant change wasn't the wardrobe. It was the underground firing range. For 2 weeks, she spent 3 hours a day beneath the estate. The range was a sterile, concrete tunnel, completely soundproofed from the house above. The first time she fired the Glock 19, the recoil snapped her wrists back so hard she dropped the weapon. She had expected Roman to yell. She had expected the ruthless Mafia boss to lose his temper at her weakness. He didn't. He just picked the gun up, checked the safety, and handed it back to her. You are fighting the weapon, Roman said, stepping directly behind her. He didn't treat her like glass anymore. He treated her like steel that needed to be forged. He wrapped his large, calloused hands over hers, forcing her grip higher on the frame. His chest pressed flush against her back, his breath hot against her neck. Don't brace for the explosion, Sadie. Anticipating the violence makes you hesitate. accept that the violence is going to happen, and pull the trigger. By the end of the second week, her collarbone was bruised black and blue from the kickback of a heavier rifle, and there were calluses forming on the soft pads of her fingers. She learned to clear a jam in 3 seconds. She learned to drop a magazine without looking. Most importantly, she learned to shoot with both eyes open. The staff treated her like an active explosive. Gordon stopped speaking to her entirely. Miller nodded respectfully when she walked the grounds. She was no longer the maid who needed saving. She was the boss's shadow. The test came on a Thursday night. It was pouring rain, the kind of torrential downpour that turned the estate grounds into a muddy swamp and masked all sound. Sadie was awake at 2 a.m. She was sitting in the dark in her new suite, a glass of water on the nightstand, the Glock resting cold and heavy on her thigh. She couldn't sleep. The house felt wrong. The air pressure in the hallway had shifted. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the thick Persian rug. She gripped the pistol, her thumb resting on the safety. She crept out of her room and moved down the sweeping main staircase. The security detail was supposed to be rotating shifts, but the foyer was completely empty. A faint draft cut through the stale air of the ground floor. It smelled like wet pavement. Sadie moved toward the kitchen. She didn't turn on the lights. She used the shadows, pressing her back against the cool plaster of the hallway, exactly the way Roman had taught her to clear corners. She reached the archway of the kitchen and stopped. The heavy back door was ajar. The reinforced glass pane near the handle had been cleanly removed, completely bypassed without triggering the alarm. Standing by the stainless steel island was a man. He wasn't one of Roman's guards. He was wearing a dark, soaking wet raincoat, his muddy boots staining the pristine marble floor. He held a suppressed pistol in his right hand, slowly sweeping the barrel toward the servant quarters. He was a professional. He was here to collect the debt Dominic felt he was owed. He was here to eliminate the soft spot. Sadie didn't scream. 2 weeks ago, she would have dropped to the floor and prayed. Tonight, she stepped out of the shadow. She raised the Glock. She didn't brace for the explosion. She clicked the safety off. The metallic click was barely audible over the rain, but in the dead quiet of the kitchen, it was a siren. The man whipped around, bringing his suppressed weapon up with terrifying speed. Sadie pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening. Unsuppressed, the 9mm round tore through the kitchen like a bomb detonating. The flash illuminated the dark room in a split second of violent white light. The heavy bullet caught the intruder dead in the center of his chest. The kinetic force threw him backward. He slammed into the refrigerator, his weapon clattering uselessly to the marble floor, before he slid down into a lifeless, bleeding heap. Sadie's ears rang violently. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder instantly choked the air. Her hands were shaking, but she kept the gun raised, the front sight pinned securely on the man's motionless body. Footsteps thundered down the main stairs, heavy, fast, and frantic. Roman burst into the kitchen a second later. He was shirtless, a massive, lethal weapon gripped tightly in his hands, his eyes wild and scanning for the threat. He saw the shattered back door. He saw the dead hitman bleeding out onto the expensive tile. Then he looked at Sadie. She stood barefoot in the center of the room. The weapon was still locked in her grip, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. She didn't look terrified. She looked hollowed out, fundamentally and permanently changed. Roman lowered his weapon. The wild panic in his dark eyes dissolved into something ancient and possessive. He walked slowly across the kitchen, stepping over the spreading pool of blood without a second glance, until he stood right in front of her. He reached out and gently pushed the barrel of the Glock down toward the floor. His hands were completely steady as he cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away the invisible residue of the violence. "I told you," Roman whispered, the gravel in his voice anchoring her to the floor. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers in the smoky, blood-soaked kitchen. You aren't invisible anymore. Sadie closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him over the gunpowder. She had traded the bleach for blood and the pink carnations for dark roses. She wasn't just surviving the monster's house anymore. She belonged in it. The transformation of Sadie from a terrified maid to a lethal survivor in Roman Costa's brutal world is complete. She traded bleach for gunpowder and fear for power. This dark, gripping Mafia romance proves that sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to become part of it, claiming your own space among the monsters. If you enjoyed this intense, pulse-pounding story, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive audio dramas. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload, and leave a comment sharing your favorite moment from the series.